Welcome back to Powered by Play. I'm Drew, and I'm a professor of theater at Chapman University in Southern California.
I'm Avery, and I'm a theatrical scenic designer. Every month on this podcast, we explore what we play, how we play, and why we play.
We believe play powers us, and that's what makes it powerful.
All right, Drew.
All right, Avery, press play. This month, we're discussing monsters. What separates us from the monsters we know and maybe love? How do these creatures of the night teach us about ourselves and others? And what separates the realm of the playful from that of the dangerous and malevolent?
So, some of my favorite monsters have been from the world of Pokemon, which, basically you go around this fictional world. You have these balls called Pokeballs. They're red and white, and then you throw them at creatures in the world, and then you could capture them. And then you train them up so that they grow up big and strong, and then they can attack other Pokemon for a professional sports kind of atmosphere. And the world of Pokemon is centered a lot around incorporation of these creatures into their everyday lives. So I watched the show growing up, I played the games up until the third generation because every few years or so, or every year, they would release new Pokemon, new shows, new games. But I only stayed active in it until the third generation. There's been like seven or eight or nine now, and I have played recent games, but they just don't hit the same anymore. But one of my core memories is that my sister and I, when we would sleep in the same room growing up, and we would be told to go to sleep, but instead of actually sleeping, we would recite all of the Pokemon in order from memory. And this was back when there were only like 151, so we'd start off with Bulbasaur, Ivysaur, Venusaur, Charmander. I can't remember it at all now, but I had it down pat back then. And some of my other personal fascinations came from mythology and monsters from all kinds of cultures, from Chinese mythology to Greek mythology, Egyptian, sponsored a lot by Rick Riordan, of course, with the Percy Jackson series, Kane Chronicles, which were the Egyptian ones, Magnus Chase, which was North mythology, which I kind of read in high school when I had been starting to outgrow, his genre and stuff. But all kinds of mythology compilations and monsters from griffins to Pegasus to basilisks and dragons were I was totally obsessed with. Specifically dragons. There was a series of books called the Dragonology books, which I was delighted to have found at a flea market one day in my youth so that I didn't have to pay the whole price. But this big Dragonology book was like red with a big dragon on the front, and when every page that you flip, there's interactive elements to it. Like there's envelopes that you can open, little notes and field research. Like this book was framed as a research device, and so it talked a lot about different types of dragons, what they lived, what kinds of elements that they could breathe, how their bodies were constructed, how they evolved. It took a very curious and scientific approach to dragons rather than the other narrative around dragons is where humans fear them, try to destroy them, steal their treasure, and all of that. And this kind of curious scientific mindset was also exemplified in the How to Train Your Dragon books and movies, where the whole society starts out being very afraid of dragons and training to destroy them. But there's one little kid who comes along and he says, "No, I don't really want to fight them or destroy them. I want to learn more about them and become friends with them." And yeah, dragons and other creatures have really shaped my upbringing and my sense of imagination about the world. What about you, Drew?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I really enjoyed the Rick Riordan books too when I read them when they were getting popular, and I read them with my daughter. They were fantastic. And I also watched the Pokemon cartoons. And one of the things that I loved about Pokemon was actually not necessarily the Pokemon themselves, but I loved Team Rocket, Jesse and James. And I don't know what fascinated me about them. the bumbling sidekicks of the villain. And I think it was their theatricality. Whoever the voice actors were, they were just fantastic. And I specifically remember doing the voices for my daughter, Jessie and James. And
Yeah, oh my gosh.
I remember just being very, very silly, and they had their own Pokemon. It wasn't like the bad guys didn't have Pokemon. They did too. The Pokemon were not limited to the heroes, so that was pretty cool.
My siblings and I would also roleplay as Jesse, James, and Meowth too, because there's 3 of
Yes.
us and 3 of them, and yeah, all the voices. We would just quote, Jesse and James so much.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then when I was a little kid, I watched Sesame Street. And these were the days when Sesame Street was really, really beginning. One of the great ideas that happened with that show was to combine the Muppets with the human actors. And originally, they had planned to have the Muppets, some of the Muppets being monsters, some of the Muppets were supposed to resemble people, like Ernie and Bert, for example, and Oscar is a grouch rather than a person or a monster. But then you actually had the monsters like Cookie Monster, Telly Monster, Grover, the two-headed monster, and then later Elmo. And the show made the decision rather than separate the Muppet segment from the human segment, what they would do was combine both and have them living, as with Pokemon, side by side. And this was supposed to, when they shared the same space, this was supposed to be a metaphor for community, what a block was like in an urban setting, and sharing space with those who were not like ourselves. So Big Bird would be in the same space as Maria, or Mr. Hooper would be in the same space as Cookie Monster, and they could interact. When I was a kid, that was the heyday. So the 80s was the heyday of Jim Henson and Jim Henson's workshop, Creature Workshop. And so Henson did, of course, Muppets for his own movies like Labyrinth and Dark Crystal and those movies, but also worked with the Star Wars movies. And so I loved all of the Henson creatures or monsters in anything. The character of Jabba the Hutt in Return of the Jedi was just absolutely fascinating. And the evil kind of Skeksis, the vulture-like creatures in the Dark Crystal, anything that had Henson working on it, that was going to be a cool monster or a cool creature. But as I got older, I think I created a separation between monster movies and then movies that had people who were threats. So monster movies might have been things like Jaws, for example, or the old Universal monster movies, and like Dracula or Frankenstein or things like that. And those threats and that danger seemed kind of, because they were monsters, they were set apart because it was easy to say, oh, monsters don't exist, although I suppose sharks exist. Sharks are kind of easy to stay away from. Sharks stay in their own area. But then there were things like the Stephen King books, which I started reading when I was probably too young to start reading them, probably like sixth grade, or movies, thriller movies like Silence of the Lambs, for example, because those were dangers that were very human. Those were dangers that actually, unlike sharks, could be waiting for you around the corner. So my conception of monster and danger changed as I kind of got into later elementary school and high school.
I've always enjoyed seeing those internet videos of when a scuba diver is diving near a great white shark or other shark, and then they just boop the nose or turn it upside down or something, and the shark is just completely dangerless, you know?
Yeah, yeah, it has a very accessible weakness.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
Of course, that requires that you would be brave enough to bump it on its nose, but I suppose if it's a choice between that And getting chomped, I suppose bumping it on its nose is the choice that's going to make sense.
Yeah. We've also asked our friends about what their favorite monsters are. I've gotten some cool responses. One of them said talking spiders is one of their most interesting ones. They said spiders are already cool and scary, which is correct in my opinion, but they're cooler and scarier when they also reveal that they're intelligent. Some examples are the black arachnia from Transformers, or Aragog from the Harry Potter universe, who's a giant spider, and Charlotte from Charlotte's Web. And I didn't realize that there were so many talking spiders out there until they brought that up. So that's really interesting because I remember most of us had to read Charlotte's Web in school growing up.
Oh, yeah.
Someone else mentioned headless men, which are called acephaloi in Greek or blemmies in Latin. They're just humans who lack a head, and instead their facial features are on their chest. There's just like a lot of origins stories around them, and even art that depicts them. Someone likes the Sphinx, which has the head of a human, the body of a lion, and the wings of an eagle, and they're well known for giving you a riddle. If you don't solve it, I think they eat you, I think. There's sirens, which are half bird, half woman with alluring voices. And sirens are a common word that we use nowadays too. Like, don't listen to the siren song, or, she's such a siren, which indicates that someone's dangerous and alluring at the same time. My friend said about the monster called the Swamp Thing, he's just a neat guy and a bit misunderstood. I'm just gonna leave that description at that. And then some favorite monsters from Dungeons and Dragons world. The gelatinous cube, which is just a giant square of mindless gelatinous matter. It can be like 10 to 15 feet wide, which is pretty large, and up to 50,000 pounds. And my friend said he's mostly just a jiggly fella. And then the last one is a periton, which is a giant eagle with a demonic stag head with like fangs and stuff. And its shadow was said to appear as an outline of whatever creature whose heart it ate last, usually an adult human, and in some cases, specifically a female. Interesting theme around the females here, as females can be either used as bait to lure other humans in a way that maybe men have historically not been written to do so.
Yeah, there's no siren call from a buff guy, I suppose.
Yeah.
Standing on the edge of the beach. That is really interesting. Oh, also the succubi.
Mm.
So the demons that try to lure men, succubi are typically female as well. So yeah, that is really interesting. Talking spiders, also, we can't forget Shelob in Lord of the Rings. I guess it's a trope. I guess you're right. I agree. I had no idea how many talking spiders there were. I asked the question to a few of my family and friends. Here's what they came up with. I had three responses. My cousin said Grimace from McDonald's, the big purple guy. I think
Oh.
Grimace maybe is supposed to represent soda. I don't know. I have no idea, but Grimace. And then my cousin's husband said the Gamork from Neverending Story, the kind of wolf-like creature who is serving the nothing and is just there to attack Atreyu. I I remember very, very clearly. Avery, have you seen Neverending Story?
No, I have not.
All right. Well, I suppose I shouldn't spoil this for you. But the appearance of the Gamork in Neverending Story is one of those moments in childhood cinema that I will never, never forget. And my other cousin said the Weeping Angels from Doctor Who, and the way that you have to keep looking at them, because if you look away, then they can send you into the past. So they're very powerful. They look like angels that you might see in a graveyard or a mausoleum or something like that. So they're statues that they don't look like they move, but if you look away from them, then you look back at them, they will move, and if they touch you, they get you, and they throw you into the past. And so I do have to admit, Avery, when my daughter was younger, when I would play in a swimming pool with her, I had this game that I would play, which was the Weeping Angels. And so it was kind of like, you know, that game where you're the keeper of a museum or something, and you look away from the statues, the other players are statues, and you're trying
Mm,
to look away, and then you look back. This is also kind of a red light, green light kind of thing.
yeah.
And then if you look back, they have to stop moving. And so I played that game with my daughter
I see.
based on the Weeping Angels of Doctor Who, a very, very interesting modern monster.
I see.
But I suppose we better define our terms. Avery, I think we had better talk about what makes something or someone a monster.
Well, I think we've learned to associate monster with danger, primarily through the stories that we tell about them, but even the images that we see about them as well. And I feel like they often represent our greatest fears and threats to our existence or our greatest values. They appear a lot in horror, fantasy, science fiction, folklore, mythology, and religion. And they're passed down a lot through, well, as kids, sometimes your parents might tell you. My parents didn't tell me about the bogeyman, but I think that's a thing in America that kids grow up believing that there's a bogey person underneath their bed or in their closet.
Yeah, sometimes it's parents, sometimes it's other kids.
Yeah.
I'm scared of the boogeyman under my bed. Aren't you scared of the one under your bed? Kind of thing.
Yeah. I remember once in kindergarten, I think some other girls taught me about the Bloody Mary ritual to perform in the bathroom,
Oh, yeah.
where I think it was like close the doors, turn off the lights, leave all the things running, and like chant some recitation or something, and look in the mirror or whatever too. And so there's kind of that element of play that you kind of have growing up as well. Monsters might be dangerous, aggressive, and look strange or grotesque in appearance. They usually are supposed to cause terror or fear. Although, now it can also be argued sometimes that they're just chilling, like the gelatinous cube. Like, yeah, it's just a jiggly fella just chilling. They can be either animal-like or human-like or none of the above, supernatural or alien-like, and oftentimes, yeah, capable of destroying us or destruction in general or threatening the social or moral order of our world. In historical texts, they've been represented by Grendel in Beowulf, or Frankenstein's monster by Mary Shelley, or Dracula by Bram Stoker. There's so many origins to it where it's such a ancient cultural thing to kind of talk about monsters and where they come from and the way that they're fictional too. It's so like why do we care to tell so many fictional stories about these fake creatures that in the end can't really hurt us? What's the point in that?
Yeah, these are great questions. Where did they come from? Why do they stick around? Why are monsters still there? And I did look into the etymology of the word too. And Merriam-Webster talked about that the etymology was from a Latin word meaning portent or warning. Exactly what you were talking about. Be careful. And I think of you were talking about the bogeyman or childhood monsters. I also think of La Llorona. So the particularly in Mexico, but in Latin American countries, the wailing woman who has drowned her children, and if kids stay out late at night and if they are by water, La Llorona could come and get them. So stay in the house, kids, because you do not want La Llorona to have access to you. And early on, monster seemed to be kind of synonymous with creature. Strange or terrifying shape is what Merriam Webster said. So, as opposed to an animal, something that went beyond and you're right, was connected with causing terror or fear. I wanted to look specifically at Gothic horror, Avery, because you mentioned Frankenstein, you mentioned Dracula. There are all kinds of monsters who appear in sort of the Georgian period in Britain and then the following Victorian period. And Gothic horror was trying to get back to what scared people back in the day before science gave us a whole bunch of comfort. What was frightening? And it seems like there were two elements, two kind of strategies with Gothic horror. The first one, how close the monsters are to ourselves. What is the monstrous within us? So, Jekyll and Hyde, of course, is the great example of this. Or something like the portrait of Dorian Gray. So, what is the monster that lives within us and how do we keep it contained? But also, Gothic horror looks at the not I, the monstrous other, the people or creatures out there in society who you mentioned grotesque, right? There's some kind of bodily difference. And again, with Merriam-Webster, it says a person of unnatural or extreme ugliness, deformity, wickedness, or cruelty. And these were very much put together. So, what was on the outside revealed what was on the inside. So, a vampire was dangerous, or a mummy was dangerous. And I think that you and I will both have something to say about that as we go along, separating those two ideas. But the word monster has gone way beyond that, way, way, way beyond that. And sometimes we take that person of extreme ugliness, deformity, wickedness, or cruelty, and we apply it to real people. And we say, that person was a monster because of what they did in this crime that they committed. So, with the rise of true crime and the rise of people finding out what happened, transcripts of trials and other things like that, criminals may have the word monster layered on them. But it's also just a term that has become a measure of something being out of proportion, usually bigger or more powerful. Monster energy drinks. It's not just a drink, it's an energy drink. It's powerful. Or monster trucks. It's not just a truck that you might see going down the road, it's a monster truck that's going to roll over other monster trucks. Or you might even, people say things like, wow, that movie was a monster hit. Or I've got a monster headache, just indicating something that is so much bigger than or out of proportion or more powerful than. So it covers a lot of ground nowadays.
And one of the questions that we're here to discuss is why do we like to adapt and readapt monster stories so much? I believe that monsters are inevitably only stories and they're infinitely adaptable to different contexts for that reason. So take the musical Avenue Q, where Princeton, a human, falls in love with Kate Monster, who's a monster who wants love and wants to start a school for monsters. Oh wait, I forgot. This is also a Muppet Sesame Street adaptation that takes
Oh,
a
yeah.
it's a with adult twists that adapts the Muppet Sesame Street genre into an adult context. And also is intended to be comedic as well. The Jekyll and Hyde musical was I think that was my first exposure to the Jekyll and Hyde story, and that was kind of how I really fell in love with that story. But after loving it for a while, and I also stage managed it in high school as well, so that was why I knew it. I'm not a performer right now in that regard. But I really want to see a feminist adaptation of that, so much so that I actually wrote a whole outline for a fictional story that I had thought up of a adaptation where it featured a female protagonist who was a person of color rather than, just this white guy from England. This world is diverse, and not every story is going to make every single person feel seen and heard. I think the thing about the Jekyll and Hyde story that was so appealing to me was the drama, the gothic monstrosity, the aesthetic, like the skirts and the costumes were so cool, and the era of it all. But to feel that all the women in this show were just pretty voices and kind of sidelines to the main character. It didn't make me as a human feel as empowered, as I kind of felt like I deserved to be through this story.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I was thinking as you were talking about, hey, wouldn't it be cool to see how this would affect a woman of color? I was thinking about Disney's movie Turning Red
Mm.
and the red panda that
Yeah.
explodes from her as she's. But interestingly, Avery, she has to get to a certain age before the red panda appears. But it very much is kind of like it's not really like a Mr. Hyde who is horrible and has lost track of what is kind and what is legal and stuff like that. The red panda is just kind of a little bit funny and maybe destroys a few things just because of its size.
Yeah, that's an amazing connection. I didn't think about it that way yet. Some other adaptations include the Frankenstein story. There was the comedy musical Young Frankenstein by Mel Brooks, which I also stage managed that in high school. Just one of the key moments, well, not key. One of the funniest moments is when they walk up to the door of the castle, and one of the characters is like, "Wow, those are some big knockers." And this in the set design, they're literally the largest, roundest, biggest knockers that could possibly fit on those double doors. Whenever I see a picture of a set, that features that, it's just funny because it's funny. And then and then I remember during quarantine I watched the National Theater release on YouTube. They released a performance of a adaptation of Frankenstein featuring Benedict Cumberbatch or Johnny Lee Miller as the creature and Victor Frankenstein. So on different shows they would play one of them would play either the creature or the other one would play the creature. So they would switch. That was really a cool concept where, you played with the idea of monstrosity in a literal sense by just switching the actors, and thus those actors' interpretations of the role.
Sometimes when we adapt these stories and we adapt them in different ways, they become manageable. And especially things like vampires or werewolves, we get to interpret them the way we want, and we get to be playful with them. I'm thinking of the Count from Sesame Street, who it's hilarious because he looks like Count Dracula, kind of, but he's purple and smiley. And what does he do? He counts. But when he reaches the number that he's going for, he laughs, ha, 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 ha. And there's lightning behind him, lightning and thunder. And so take something that's relatively scary, this idea of a noble vampire who's very powerful and creates a way to teach kids about numbers, or Hotel Transylvania and making them into literal cartoon characters. So, what would it be like if they were a family? What would it be like if they were all living together and just kind of trying to make things work, just like the Addams family or the Munsters? I think there were a lot of sort of attempts to say, what would it be like if they tried to kind of fit into society? And another thing, speaking of musicals, another thing that we've been seeing recently is villains being deconstructed and looking at their perspectives. The sort of probably the primary example of this that many people are familiar with is Wicked, which was a book and then a musical trying to understand why the so called Wicked Witch of the West was the way she was, why she had it in for the wizard and what was going on. But we've seen this happen with a few different creatures right now, Cruella and Maleficent. And with Cruella, I was wondering how on earth are they going to make a villain who wants to skin puppies and make them into coat sympathetic? How on earth are they going to have an origin story for her? But they managed to do it. So understanding where does the monster come from? Is this person really a monster? Who gets to say who a monster is? I was also thinking about the graphic novel and now animated movie Nimona. So, Nimona who was created by Nate Stevenson. And Nate Stevenson is a man who's gone through transition, struggled with what did it mean to be a girl back in his childhood. And so Nimona is a shapeshifter and literally can change into whatever kind of animal or creature she wants. And Nate Stevenson dedicates the book on the very first page, the graphic novel, to all the monster girls and trying to figure out what is it inside you that gets called monstrous, that gets called too much. And so Nimona is a really interesting study of what is that line? What is that line that crosses into, okay, that's becoming dangerous? Similar to Turning Red, similar to the Red Panda, when do you start destroying things or scaring people, and when is that crossing a line?
That's a really good point. I think when we roleplay we come to terms with what we would do when we're in danger in real life, or what we would do when we feel like we have a monster inside ourselves. What do we do then? And that's one of the really most important parts about, why we keep playing with monsters. Like I said in Pokemon, when you're collecting and training them to obey you in battle, that's a very playful lens of it. And the way that artists and game makers and storytellers shape the lens of the media that you're in which you're playing with monsters is very important, because Pokemon could be very dark and bloody, but is actually portrayed as colorful, inviting, exciting, and safe. And even the story of Ash Ketchum traveling the world at 10 years old to train monsters like 100 times his size sometimes, and make them breathe fire and poison you and fly and dive and cause earthquakes, and that sounds so unsafe. Like, literally speaking, that sounds so unsafe, especially for a 10-year-old. Um, and not to mention they're also camping out in the wilderness all the time and making their own food too. Like, oh my gosh. But the story of this franchise is that it's a fun adventure. You are here to challenge yourself, discover who you are. But at the end of the day, Ash is safe. He doesn't die, and his friends have his back, and the Pokemon that he trains love him. I don't think any of his Pokemon like decide to turn around and attack him back, you know? So through that lens of play, there is that mood that you leave the franchise with. A board game that my siblings and I have played a lot is called Spirit Island, where each player plays as a spirit who has to fight off settler colonizers from their land. And that's an interesting take where in a lot of other games, you might play the colonizer figure trying to conquer a certain land, but in this this turn of perspective, you get to be what the humans consider dangerous, but you get to experience the perspective of protecting your land and the joy when you evict strangers, strangers who are trying to take advantage of your land, and that's the end goal. Another board game is called Bargain Quest that I played recently with my siblings as well, where you are a medieval shopkeeper. You're trying to sell things to heroes so that they can go fight monsters. That was such a fun experience because you can, you can only you have to display certain items, you can only sell certain items, the heroes only have a certain amount of money. So sometimes you might know that this piece of armor is not going to be enough to defeat the boss that they're trying to defeat, but you can sell it to them anyway. Just sell them the piece of armor, and if they don't make it out, well, you made your money, and from your perspective, you're winning. And some video games that often feature monsters are a lot of roguelike dungeon crawlers, which is a genre where you as the player are kind of inserted into a dungeon, you fight the monsters in one room, then you pass to the next one, and so on and so forth until you die, and then you have to start right at the beginning again. Such as Heroes of Hammerwatch, Hades, where you have to escape the underworld, Rotwood, where you fight corrupted beasts in forests, and Slay the Spire, which is a card game with like bizarre creatures, but still a roguelike.
The flip side of a roguelike dungeon crawler, I played a game called Keep the Heroes Out, so I gotta give a shout out to my friend Matthew here, who has this game and really wanted to play and loved the idea of this game. So it's the flip side of the heroes coming storming into the dungeon. And this is a board game where the players are cooperating like Spirit Island to drive the heroes out and guard the treasure because all the monsters want to do is live in peace and just enjoy their treasure. And so the heroes are the invaders. Just like Spirit Island, why are the heroes there? Why do they think they're heroes? Another game that I was thinking about was King of Tokyo, and I think we're going to get to Godzilla in a little bit. But this is a board game where each player has a particular kaiju or big monster that they send to fight to the death. And this is kind of reminiscent of maybe BattleBots fighting in an arena or Pokemon or even the real life horrible practice of cockfighting where you have two chickens going and fighting to the death in a pit for money. And so the kaiju will fight for you. They will be your avatars or they will be your essentially, this sounds horrible to say, but essentially your property and going and fighting for you so that you can take over the city.
Mm.
But one of my favorite role playing with monsters experiences, going back again to my childhood, there was a little golden book called Grover and the Monster at the End of This Book. And Avery, I don't know if you've ever read this book.
Oh, I think I have.
Do you remember this?
Oh,
This is one of the most brilliant books I have ever read in my entire life because it is absolutely breaking the fourth wall. And the reader is turning the pages, and Grover, the Sesame Street monster. My sister called this out, by the way, also when I said, hey, what are your memories of monsters or what are your favorite monsters? Grover is saying, didn't you read the title of the book? There's a monster at the end of this book. Please don't turn the page. But the reader, the kid, does exactly what Grover says not to do because that's what you do with a book. You turn the page. And so it's this really interesting thing where Grover is begging you not to keep turning pages. And he starts to try to like glue pages together or tape pages or fill the pages with word balloons so that you can't see any monsters that would come up. And the child is just gleefully turning pages and turning pages and turning pages. And you get to the end of the book, the last couple of pages, and of course, Grover is the monster at the end of the book. And there was nothing to fear because Grover is a cozy monster. And so Grover just looks at the reader and says, thank you. Thank you for showing me that it was just me and there was nothing to be afraid of. And this book is just absolutely brilliant in its meta nature. And it's every kid is going to hear Grover talking to them a little bit differently. And at some point, I wonder if there are actually kids who say, well, Grover, I don't want to hurt your feelings. I don't want to scare you. I'm going to put the book down before I even get to the end. And maybe a parent or adult who is reading with the kid is like, no, no, we've got to keep reading the book. And the kid might think, no, 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 Grover said no. I don't want Grover to be upset. But talk about a very, very early role playing experience with a monster. That stuck with me for years, and I think I may still have that book around somewhere.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I had not remembered that, but you brought up a very distinct memory, so thank you.
Absolutely, Avery.
Another game of monsters that I have done a lot of research on before is called Undertale, a 2016 video game by Toby Fox that has hit the world by storm ever since then. Specifically, the world of this game features a history where there was a war between humans and monsters, and the humans from the surface trapped the monsters in the underground. And the monsters in this underground world are not an evil species, they just live there. And you, as the player, are a human who goes into this monster world, and you're able to take a route to find your way out through either killing all the monsters, or killing no monsters, or somewhere in between. And this game really challenges the player's assumption of monsters that they come in with. Like, a lot of players would start the game, they would, kill the first few monsters and then regret it immediately and then restart the game and not kill any. Because the monsters in here they have personalities, lives, likes, jobs, loves, families. They talk. They can be scary looking, but once you get to know them through your actions in you can like battle them. So like in Pokemon, when you come face to face with a monster, all you have to choose is what attack to use or whether to run away. But in Undertale, you can choose what attack to use, but you can also be like hug or do nothing or talk or something like that. And the fact that these monsters it's said that they have souls, which are made of love, hope, and compassion. And if a monster doesn't want to fight, then its defenses will weaken, and the crueler the intentions of their enemies, the more that their attacks will hurt them, according to some lore that the game tells you. There's a library, and the sign of the library is spelled Librarby, and because it's cute, monsters can't spell. In monster funerals, so there are monster funerals where when monsters get old and kick the bucket, they turn into dust. At funerals, they take that dust and spread it on that person's favorite thing, and then their essence will live on in that thing. Oh my gosh, like how could you kill any monsters in this world? Like they are so alive. And even this little snippet, it didn't mention when monsters get killed by a human with a lot of determination. Like they're expecting to live old and just chill out and like live their lives. And this whole game was such a experience and so thematic in the message of who really is the monster in the scenario. Like, because if you go down the route where you kill every monster, then all of the monsters in the world are terrified of you and you become their monster. Do you really want to do that?
Oh, wow. That's wild that you can kind of like gain a reputation and that it will follow you
Yeah.
really fast. I was also thinking about stories in which humans are involved in creating monsters. So I'm thinking here, the classic example, besides Frankenstein, which I'll talk about in a second, is Godzilla. That through humans' atomic warfare, through humans messing with these incredible powers, they create a creature who rises from Tokyo Bay and then takes out its aggression on the city of Tokyo. And it's very similar. This has been seen in other stories where some post apocalyptic event, like Fallout, I'm thinking, for example, Fallout and the ghouls that radiation has created, these creatures who are now monstrous. And it's our fault, Avery. It was us. We did it. And then, of course, Frankenstein and the brilliance of looking at science and saying, what do we create when we play God, when we try to do something that should be beyond our capabilities and our ethical responsibilities? Frankenstein and what happens when the monster awakens and tries to find what it is supposed to be doing. There have been infinitely many versions of Frankenstein, including Young Frankenstein, as you pointed out, which is taking it and looking at, oh my goodness, how could this creature just kind of be funny rather than frightening? Jurassic Park, also playing God, going for money or going for power, all kinds of ways that humans try to reach beyond and access something that through our own monstrosity ends up creating literal monsters that then end up going and attacking us. But you're right in that some creatures, I'm thinking of the he's just a jiggly guy, the gelatinous cube, some monsters are just creatures who have been branded monsters because of being banished or shamed, mostly because of their appearance. So here I'm thinking of maybe going back to Greek mythology, Medusa, the Minotaur, created by human or godly mistakes or human or godly misbehavior, and so they are called monsters and they are exiled and they become dangerous, even deadly to look upon. But in the modern day, going back to the Gothic, we have Quasimodo, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, and we have the Phantom of the Opera. And the filmmaker and writer Guillermo and artist Guillermo del Toro talks about he found as a kid, he found a space for himself in the grotesque. That he wanted to live among these monsters that he would read about. Phantom of the Opera, okay, as a young man, this had a particular effect. I sang this was back in the days of cassette tapes. And so I had my cassette tapes of Phantom. And I will tell you that my favorite character to sing was Eric, the Phantom of the Opera, because let's face it, he gets the best songs and he has the most emotional content. And yes, okay, fine. He's trying to kill people because he wants to give Christine Daae a chance and he wants to kind of take over the Paris Opera House. But I mean, he didn't start out that way. He was kind of turned into the Phantom of the Opera, and that mask, that iconic half mask that became the symbol for that musical and has been associated with the Phantom of the Opera for ages, and just keeping the monstrous or keeping the grotesque hidden in order not to scare people. But these are great questions about who gets to decide who or what is a monster, and how do we acknowledge that we are responsible.
Yeah. And there's also a lot about the story around monsters that involves humans and what the humans do about surviving or defeating or overcoming them. Going back to Greek mythology, the myth of Odysseus on his long journey home, he faces the Cyclops Polyphemus. The Cyclops eats some of his men. Odysseus comes up with a plan to say that his name is nobody, so that when he stabs the eye of the Cyclops calls for help, but the other Cyclops don't think that it's a threat because he says, "Nobody is stabbing me, nobody's attacking me." They're like, "All right, cool." But afterwards, when Odysseus escapes, instead of just going back to his ship silently, he turns around and he's like, "Actually, it wasn't a nobody. It was me, Odysseus. I live at this address and my zip code is this." Like, he literally.
Oh yeah.
And then Polyphemus, the Cyclops, just is like, "Dad, Poseidon, curse this guy. He hurt me." And then Odysseus, he's given like a bag of wind from Aeolus, the wind god, and the crew opens this bag of wind while Odysseus sleeps because they don't trust him and they think it's treasure. And then just as Ithaca is in sight, the bag of wind explodes and blows them all the way back the way they came. What a fatal flaw to have. And oftentimes, hubris, which is this overwhelming sense of pride, is a flaw that a lot of Greek heroes have for good reason because it's universal. Another Greek story is where Theseus, this guy, is trying to defeat the Minotaur, who's a half bull, half man monster in a labyrinth designed by Daedalus. And so this Theseus hero It defeats the Minotaur with strength, sure, and he escapes it with this string that a female that he's, charmed or whatever, Ariadne. So she gives him a ball of yarn, helps him escape, and then afterwards he abandons her on an island after promising that he was gonna like protect her forever. And like, bro, like that is so cruel. And me like on an island after you escape from her family together, and then yeah. So anyway,
Yeah, Greek sailor guys don't have the best track record, do they?
they really don't.
Jason and Medea, too.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, the golden
I
fleece.
know.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah. There's also monsters in scary movies where humans have to like sacrifice their senses, such as A Quiet Place, where the humans had to survive by not making sounds, so that because the monster was only motivated by sounds. And then there's Bird Box, which was a Netflix sensation, where the humans had to survive from the monsters by blindfolding them outside because the monsters, whenever whoever saw it, would commit suicide immediately. There's monsters that change shape to look like what you fear most. I think in it, right? Because I haven't seen it or A Quiet Place because I'm not great with horror movies, but I've read. Done this is the beauty of research. Anyway, I think in it there's like this monster that it's like a clown, but it can also change shape. But also in that movie, interestingly, the abusive parents are also portrayed as monsters as well. So the children have to survive both their parents and the monster, which is also
Yes,
interesting.
they do.
And then yeah, going back to Godzilla, I watched my first Godzilla film. It was Godzilla Minus One, released last year, and a kaiju film. Kaiju means it's a Japanese term with just media involving giant monsters, and I think that one specifically had a lot of post-war Japanese themes of should I sacrifice myself to save my country? At what point is it normal or expected to sacrifice yourself in the name of saving others? I don't know. It had a lot more complicated themes than that. I don't know. I think Godzilla, it just looks so dorky to me. I can't help it. It's just this giant, big, massive reptile, and it has tiny little arms. And yeah, it's dangerous. And the movie's special effects, I think they got like an Academy Award or something, and
Yes, they
they
did.
were amazing and beautiful film, beautiful movie. I personally just, it's just like a but I will say the beauty of this movie was that even though it featured a giant reptile with a heat ray and tiny arms stomping on buildings, even though it had that, that wasn't the main heart of the film. Like the heart of this film was in its protagonist overcoming survivor's guilt, overcoming his fears, and going through a lot of emotional trauma from war and other, effects from the monster and coming out alive at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. The Godzilla trope, which, like we talked about, began with the dropping of the atomic bomb, has become something that is flexible enough that it can reflect all kinds of different attitudes and values and beliefs and stories. And it has transcended the beginning of the kaiju stories and has become something that is applies very widely these days.
Yeah, like, because we said it's not just about the monster, it's also about the different stories and context that it appears in and the different heroes that represent different parts of humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. So these are the stories that we tell ourselves. You talked about surviving, like Odysseus survives, or A Quiet Place, they survive, or defeating monsters, or overcoming monsters, whether those are external or internal, and things like grief and loss and trauma and pain. You talked about all those things. So I picked out a couple of stories that I think sort of speak to how is this useful to us. The first one is Delicious in Dungeon. So Delicious in Dungeon started out as manga and is now a Netflix series. And this is a story about characters who survive by literally eating the monsters that they have killed or other people have killed in the dungeon. And so each Each story is about a different dish. So it's almost like it's a combination of Anthony Bourdain and a dungeon crawler. So how do you make a really good dragon stew or something? Because what else are you just going to leave the monster there to rot after a hero has come in? So these are stories about going through the dungeon and being foodies, but also doing the usual roguelike stuff. The play, which many of us theater folks are familiar with, She Kills Monsters, which is a story about a young woman using her sister's adventure or campaign to learn more about her sister who was tragically killed in a traffic accident, and learning about her friends who were the other players and learning about Dungeons and Dragons. So, on the surface, this is a play about killing boss monsters and leveling up and stuff like that, and getting to Tiamat at the end of the adventure. But really, this is about Agnes, the main character, fighting her own demons, dealing with her grief, trying to figure out who is this sister that I really didn't know. And there are questions about nerdiness, there are questions about sexuality, and all kinds of interesting things folded in. And then I also wanted to mention Nietzsche's famous quote about when you fight monsters, be careful not to turn into them, which is something that just kind of like lives on. People cite that a lot. But this question of how far can you go before you become that thing that you are struggling against? And maybe this goes back to the Gothic idea of what is to be feared, and how can play teach us about that? How can we learn about what we should really fear and what is not worth fearing? What is a cozy monster and what is a dangerous monster? How far can a monster go, either a monster in us or a monster around us, before it needs to get sent back where it came from because it is posing a danger to ourselves or others? How do we tame the monsters inside us and outside? How do we make friends with them when we can? And how do we stop them when they need to be stopped? So, those were some final thoughts that I had.
Beautiful. Thanks for joining us on this episode. I hope that we were able to shed some light on what makes a monster and how we can look at them in different ways, and how other artists and authors and playwrights and game makers and storytellers have articulated them in different ways in the past. I believe monster stories have taught us to be in tune with our sense of danger, safety, and survival, but also that sometimes, or all the time, actually, no, sometimes. Sometimes there's more underneath the surface. Sometimes a monster is a scary danger that you need to get rid of. This has been Powered by Play with Avery and Drew. If you've been enjoying this podcast, you can support us online at Ko-fi. That is ko-fi.com/poweredbyplay. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll catch you next time.